me make a couple of preliminary points. We are pleased to offer an ongoing series of diverse events each season. The new events newsletter is just now available on our website and will be in your mailbox and at the front desk in the next few days, so keep an eye out. And I hope you will take a look and sign up for anything of interest. While you're enjoying our events, please recall that the library does thrive and prosper through the generosity of its donors. Tax-deductible contributions can be made at any time throughout the year. We particularly welcome underwriting for events like this one or for many other special projects. For more information, you're welcome to speak to me or to our development staff or see our website. Third, please silence your cell phones, because given the topic of this event, I personally just could not stand the irony if it were interrupted by a phone ringing. Seriously, thank you. We do have books for sale in the Peluso Family Exhibition Gallery, and Ms. Jackson will be happy to sign copies following the event. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Maggie Jackson. Thank you. A lovely sound of a cell phone for me. A couple of weeks ago, I saw one of the current plays at the Roundabout, which is about a family dealing with ADHD, and it's also entitled Distracted. It's a really brilliant set, consisted of layered fabric drops on which were projected scene changes, TV screens, text messages, video games, classroom chalkboards, and so on, sometimes related to the plot, often not. During intermission, I went out to check my voicemail. I hung around outside the stage door to meet the actors, and everybody was looking through the viewfinders of their digital cameras. This is modern life in the first world, whether we're individually diagnosed with attention deficit or not. Maggie Jackson is one of the few people paying close attention to our lack of attention, and that night at the theater drove home the lessons of her book, Distracted. Maggie has in fact been paying attention to the problems of distraction for a long time. Her first book, What's Happening to Home, examined the overlap of home and workplace, and her award-winning column in the Boston Globe often deals with the social impact of technology. Distracted, published last June, was named a Best Summer Book of 2008 by the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and has been featured in the New York Times, Business Week, Wired, Vanity Fair, the London Sunday Times, and other media worldwide. Publishers Weekly calls it a richly detailed and passionately argued account of the travails facing an ADD society and how to reinvigorate a renaissance of attention. And the Wall Street Journal is the mind on a real problem of modern life. I was pleased to hear that it just went into its third printing. It's heartening to know that so many readers are in fact paying attention. Please join me now in turning our attention to author Maggie Jackson.
Sarah, for that very nice announcement, introduction. And I'd like to thank Sarah, Mark, and all the staff at the Society Library for making this a haven of focus for readers, writers, and thinkers, no matter what your age. I'd also like to thank my agent, Emma Sweeney, for paying attention closely to this topic and to Distracted from the get-go, and for all her support and for being here tonight. Picture Freud on a warm September evening in 1907 in Rome, in the Piazza Colonna. He's watching a lantern slideshow, the short films and still slides projected on the roof of a house in the piazza. And every time he tries to move away, as he writes later, there's a certain tension in the attentive crowd that keeps him gazing. He remains, in his words, spellbound, until finally he feels lonely in the crowd and returns to his hotel to write a letter home to his family. Consider this great thinker, far from home, entranced by the precursor of media that envelop us today. The automated worlds that seized Freud just momentarily now shadow us 24/7. They're portable frontiers, offering streams of communications, information, alternate realities. Now, picture two telegraph operators, separated by miles, flirting, bantering, falling in love in Morse code. He comes to meet her. They're tongue-tied until they string a wire across 2 rooms of a boarding house, and he proposes virtually. This is a scene from Wired Love, an 1890 novel that was inspired by the real affairs of telegraph operators up and down the line in the 19th century. This realm of cyberspace that we wrestle with today and that is our meeting ground is not as new as we might think. And finally, fast forward. Picture a 21st century child, maybe your own, doing their homework. They're exposed to nearly 5 hours of non-print media a day. A third of this child and their peers will juggle 5 to 8 media while they're doing their homework. And 60% will multitask their way through their studies. And who are their role models? The average office worker, information worker, switches tasks every 3 minutes throughout the day, hopscotching from email to IM to new beat in their horizons. Half of these interruptions are self-imposed, external and internal. And half of us check our email while we're on the phone with another person. 40% of drivers age 16 to 27 text message while they're at the wheel. We've come a long way from the Piazza Colonna. We've created a culture of speed and overload and computation and collaboration and distraction. Distraction, which now means diversion, for better or worse, once upon a time meant being scattered, pulled in pieces, splintered. It's an archaic definition that fell out of use in the 18th century. But it aptly describes how many of us feel today. We connect with millions of people around the world, and yet as a culture, we have trouble sitting down to dinner with those we love. We tap into billions of information bytes, data surrounding us, and yet, are we wiser? Do we depend all too often on what's first up on Google for creation of our knowledge? Is this merely the new landscape of the digital era? The mark of success? The new look of this progress? Or is something amiss? Something called attention? Tonight, I'll talk a little bit about how we got here. What are the roots of this climate of distraction? And what happens, secondly, when we splinter and fragment our attention? What are the costs and maybe the gains? Finally, how can we create a society that's high-tech and yet reflective and caring? Because this is the task before us. As crucial, in my mind, as digging ourselves out of this financial mess or greening the planet. Because we can only meet the challenges of our day by strengthening and undermining our powers of attention. So how did we get here? Well, the economist Jeremy Rifkin once wrote, "The greatest turning points in civilizations are often triggered by changing conceptions of time and space." So let's start with time. From the industrial age inventions of the cinema, the phonograph, the camera, that tickled Freud's and other people's fancies, came the idea that we could do more than just mark time. We could control time. Humans could stop and start a moment of time, run it backwards. I mean, what was the phonograph but a vehicle for preserving the voice of even the dead? And simultaneity entranced writers and artists like James Joyce. Ulysses, in the critic Stephen Kern's words, turned one June day in Dublin into a vast, expanded present. Frederick Taylor, in Officers, was the efficiency guru who taught people to fragment work into pieces to make it go faster, so we could be more efficient, so that we could cheat the clock. Now, we layer the moment. We do 2, 3, 4 things at once, seeking the ticket to efficiency, the ticket to progress. Time splicing seems the answer to keeping up with all that we are coping with. This is why multitasking is our national pastime. And I was in Detroit last summer on a family vacation. I was a passenger in a car on a highway. We were barreling down the road and passed on the right by a man speeding by with a magazine propped up against his steering wheel. But I was the only person in our car who was surprised. Multitasking. We now layer time, and that changes how we manage our days and how we manage our attention. Second, where are we? because the experiences of space and place that we're encountering have changed just as much as our experiences of time. When George Washington died in 1799 in Virginia, it took a week for the news to reach New York. When in 1963, 70% of Americans knew in a half an hour that JFK had been assassinated. Bang, global, we're global. The railroad, the jet, the car, the telegraph collapse distance and bring us closer together psychologically and in communications. We're now experiencing the lowest levels of residential mobility since the post-war era. Just 14% of Americans change houses every year, and yet the number of miles that we drive has risen 80% in the last 20 years. Now our vocabulary denotes movement and portability. We talk about hot desking, grazing, travel soccer, dashboard dining. In a recent year, there were 1,400 products with the word go in the label, and that was a 50% rise from the year before. Cullen Murphy, the Atlantic writer, once wrote, or recently wrote, "Observe the contents of a stranger's briefcase. In all likelihood, the owner could be transported unexpectedly to Alma-Ata or Baku and still retain full access to power, money, and freshness of breath." The cultural geographer Yi-Fu Tuan defines place as a realm of pause. And space, he says, is a canvas for movement. We have chosen space. We flip between people and tasks. We layer the moment. We keep one eye on the road. And we inhabit, not just tiptoe into, we inhabit multiple alternative realities where we do much more than exchange Morse code. Real money exchanges hands in cyberspace. Job interviews are carried out. Reality becomes a slippery concept. So what does this all mean? Global villages, hypermobility, layered time. The boundaries of our experience have exploded. We live in a world of what Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, calls shifting sands. And of course, much of these technological inventions and these ways of life are advancements. We revel in this freedom to move. Hop on a plane, you're in Singapore. The earth is shrunk. There are new iterations of community. We have access to oceans of information immediately, everywhere we go. And there are looser, freer relationships. It's no coincidence that in this world I'm describing, the social hierarchies are eroding from the boardroom to the dinner table. And we have a newfound connectivity. Just 10 years ago, it was predicted by many that the internet would turn us into pasty-faced loners sitting in our rooms. Well, we're connecting on steroids. There's one sociologist, Dana Boyd, who looked at the 5-year email archive of a guy named Mike, a 24-year-old Boston, guy who works in an art installation firm, not particularly technological. And when she looked at all of his emails, including group emails, she found he has ties to 11.7 million people in the world. We are connecting. But the flip side of all of these wonders, and why we're struggling today, is often diffusion and fragmentation of time, of space, and attention. Consider the fate of thought in the cognitive age. 100 million websites, 100 million blogs at last count, and trillions of web pages. We don't even get enough into the deeper web to even see or access these. But we have oceans of data at our fingertips. But do we have the frameworks for making sense of the world around us? Do we have the architectures for deep thought that we so badly need in this age of information overload? And are we cultivating what William James once called habits of mind that can help us turn the raw data into knowledge and wisdom? I mentioned interruptions, the switching tasks every 3 minutes. Well, high levels of interruptions at work are correlated with stress, frustration, and even with lower creativity, according to work at Harvard Business School. This is why one reason people say so often, I need to get work done, I need to go home. Or the only place I can think is the shower. And kids today, who are multitasking their way through their homework, they are scoring very high on tests of their ability to access or interact on cyberspace, or to surf and collect and navigate these new worlds. But studies show they're not doing as well at evaluating and assessing information on the web. One SAT of information literacy found that just half of college students could judge the objectivity of a website. And there's a study out of UCLA, just one study, but yet gives a hint of why I hear so often from parents that my kids get A's and yet they multitask their way through their homework. This brain imaging study found that when students are studying while multitasking, they're actually using parts of their brain that are equated with shallower learning, less deep memory. They're not learning as deeply, and they're not able to transfer what they learn to new situations as flexibly. And this transference is the bedrock of experience and accumulated wisdom. So I believe that the tech tools that surround us will get more sophisticated. They will get more sensitive at interrupting us, and we will grow to use them better. And I also believe that we will begin to teach children what they need to know in the 21st century, the critical thinking skills that were not perhaps as prized in old educational systems. And yet, I worry that we're creating new forms of ignorance based not on a lack of access to information, but on the inability or unwillingness to turn information into knowledge. And I also worry that we're mistaking technological fluency, a facility with the mechanics of the tools that are so wondrous, with the ability to create this knowledge. Second, social contact. We're more highly connected than ever, and yet disconnected in so many ways. When people's core ties, their networks of friends and family expand, not to only about 24, a circle of 24, the types of interactions that go on change. People visit less, make fewer telephone calls. Of course, no snail mail anymore. But interactions by email rise. I believe that we're increasingly depending on the most faceless, thinnest means of communication media ever invented. And the email inbox does more than just take up your time. It also creates what I call optionality. That is, when you can be connected with ever-increasing numbers of people in this virtual, boundaryless world, people are optional. You can click if something's awkward and turn away. You can drift off or ignore someone. This is changing executive recruiting, online dating, social relations. 25% of Americans now say they have no close confidant. They have no one that they can tell their secrets to. That's double the number that reported such isolation 20 years ago. And when I was doing research for my book, I went to LA to interview a MacArthur Fellow, linguistic anthropologist, head of a family studies center at UCLA, Eleanor Oakes. And I wanted to talk with her about how technology would change family life after she had just completed probably the most in-depth research on the subject ever undertaken. And she wanted to tell me that people don't greet each other at the end of the day. Hi, honey, I'm home. Silence. I was dumbfounded. What could be important about that sort of 1950s relic? And we're connecting all day through cell phones and etc. Why is that important? Well, as Oakes told me, a greeting is a ritual shared by all human cultures. It is an acknowledgement of another at the cusp of a social interaction. It couldn't be more important for recognizing another, especially when you're coming back into the social fold. And then I talked to families, thinking that this would be a funny column. And people, the dog is the welcome committee, and it became a poignant and moving subject for people to discuss that they weren't greeted when they came home. According to Oakes, only half of husbands and a third of wives offer a greeting and children most of the time don't even look up. I can understand that. And because usually they're so busy or distracted or doing something else. As Oakes also said, we need a disposition to be vulnerable to interaction. Those are her words. We need the disposition to be vulnerable to interaction, one another. And she said, when we could be having a conversation, are we? So certainly, the potential of this new world is vast. Our lives are enriched by the visual media around us, the global mobility, the expanding connectivity, the information, even multitasking and skimming are new skills we need to promote. But yet, I worry that our climate of distraction is undermining our ability to focus deeply on one another and to problem solve. I worry that our new ways of life are eroding our ability to communicate, to connect, and to make meaning. Analytic problem solving, creativity, deep connection, astute awareness, long-term vision, these are the skills we need most in the 21st century. And what underlies these skills? Attention. Attention fuels our ability to focus on our goals and each other and not be abducted by distractions. Attention enables us to control ourselves. It gives us the self-discipline we need in this virtual, boundaryless world. Attention is key to awareness. It gives us our ability to have concrete perception of our surroundings and a long-term metacognitive vision of our journey ahead. So listen for a minute to the words of the renowned ADHD researcher Russell Barkley, as he talks a little bit about the characteristics of this condition. Barkley writes, people with ADHD are more under the influence of others rather than acting to control the self. They're pursuing immediate rather than deferred gratification. And they're under the influence of a temporal now more than of probable social futures that lie ahead. ADHD is a disorder of attention to the future and what one needs to do to prepare for its arrival. It is, he says, a disorder of time. Can we afford to create a culture that undermines our attentional capacities? At a time of vast uncertainty, mistrust, collapse, can we afford to nurture an attention-deficient democracy, economy, family life? We cannot. But I am optimistic. I've talked tonight about the long roots of our culture of distraction and the steep cost to the hypermobility and split focus we encounter, costs so steep that I believe we risk a dark age if we do not change. But to recover focus individually and collectively, to spark a renaissance of attention, we need to better understand this crucial human faculty. We need to learn to speak a language of attention. And that is within our grasp. What is attention? Well, William James, the philosopher and psychologist from the 19th century, said famously, everyone knows what attention is. And half of the neuroscientific papers in the medical literature start with that quote. We all know, of course, what it feels like to concentrate. At least I think most of us still do. We know what it feels like to walk into a beautiful summer's garden and feel the breeze on our skin, to smell the flowers, to be entirely aware of this garden. But to define and measure and map attention scientifically has been almost impossible for hundreds of years until recently. There's been an explosion of research into attention, and coupled with advancements in neuroimaging and genetics, scientists now actually are beginning to define what seems like a mysterious enigma. And when you ask a neuroscientist what attention is, they immediately and very confusingly begin to speak in the plural. Because attention is really not just one thing. There's still some debate, but most agree that there are three types of attention. I alluded to them just a minute ago. And also attention is, I will tell you what the 3 times are, attention is now considered an organ system, like your circulation and your digestion, in that parts of the brain and the body work in complex alignment to perform these feats of attention. And also because these 3 kinds of attention, or networks of attention, have their own circuitry, genetics, etc. So they're distinct, but work together. The first type of attention is called orienting. That's focus. It's the spotlight of your mind. It's what you need to focus on another or a problem. Second, alerting. That's wakefulness. That can run the gamut from a coma to a coffee buzz. You can be focusing on me tonight and yet be half asleep. Now you have 2 different types of attention at work here. And these 2 types of attention, I must add, are why we're biologically, because orienting, focus, and wakefulness are primed to allow us to stay tuned to the environment. That's why we're always seeking to open that email or responding to the beep and ping or the saber-toothed tiger in our environment. And finally, the 3rd type of attention is executive attention, which is a package of higher order skills related to planning, judgment, and resolution of conflicting information. The headline news, as well as the fact that we can understand attention, and that we can understand that there are different types of attention in our quiver, so to speak, the headline news is attention can be trained. There are fascinating scientific and psychological experimental works going on around the country, around the world, to map and track how attention can be trained. And it's not clear yet how long-lasting the gains are, but scientists are studying meditators. There's a whole new subfield of neuroscience related to studying meditation, because it's not the only way, but it's a 2,500-year-old practice of controlling the mind and controlling attention. Second, scientists are creating computer-generated exercises that are actually being shown to train focus and awareness. And there are behavioral activities too. But along with the internal resources that we need to tap that I've been describing related to attention, I think we also need to look at attention and distraction as a social and collective challenge before us. In other words, we really need to tackle the climate of distraction. For instance, the value systems related to attention in our country. What if we began to question that noisy, interrupt-driven living is the norm, or that rampant multitasking is the key to success? The vision of a successful businessman or woman in this country is someone who's so hyper they can barely sit down and hardly listens with more than an ear to those around them. I read an article just recently about the drive to create the quick boot computer in the New York Times, and quote, "In a new age of impatience, scientists are trying to discover computers that will start automatically. Because, as one tech executive explained, it's ridiculous to ask people to wait a couple of minutes to start up their computer." And interestingly, different types of attention have been valued in different eras. For instance, the industrial age was the height of the idealization of unbending concentration, directed focus, and as a way of assimilating large groups of people into the bureaucracies, the schools, the factory systems that were being created in the 19th century. Now, what kinds of attention do we value? We need to put this topic on the table. As well, we need to start, I think, individually and collectively refashioning time and space. It can be done. We can actually declutter the noisy, split-focus environments that surround us, especially in public places. And we can think about refashioning time. Restore the integrity of the moment, for instance. Before there was clock-based time, human beings existed for millennia on something called event-based time. In other words, a celebration, a conversation, a meeting unfolded organically or according to social and cultural norms. Toddlers are still on event-based time. If you say the party's ended, at 6 p.m., they're still having a good time, the party's still going on. So, but rich socialization, we can take a page, an inspiration from event-based time, insofar as our proclivity toward allowing interruptions to fragment our social relationships. Rich socialization cannot happen without uninterrupted time. And without rich socialization, you cannot nurture and cultivate the synchronicity that's needed for deep relationships. And finally, the third and perhaps the most important way forward, I think, is to role model attention, to give the gift of attention to others. And in closing, I'd just like to read a couple of paragraphs from my book, quoting the most powerful words related to attention that I heard in the 4 years I spent researching and writing this book. I went up to Colorado, 8,000 feet in the Rockies, to witness the end of a 3-month, the most ambitious neuroscientific study of attention training ever created. It was a 3-month study of meditators, normal people, not monks, who had taken sabbaticals and had gone and were utilizing a specific type of practice called shamatha from Tibetan Buddhism that is supposed to train attention. And the results are still coming in. And I spoke with a fellow named Alan Wallace, who is a translator to the Dalai Lama, Stanford scholar, a physicist, and he was the leader of this attention training exercise, and especially the meditation. And this is what he told me. Attending to, caring for, watching over, looking after. There's a real sweetness to that, said Alan Wallace. Clad in a sports shirt and chinos, Wallace sat cross-legged on a chair in his room at the retreat, mulling over vocabularies of attention with me, savoring each as if tasting a fine old wine. Before I headed home, he preferred a last thought. If a person leaps in and sacrifices his life, you leap in, you save a baby, and then you die, you've given your whole life in one piece, said Wallace. That's a wonderful sacrifice. That's pretty good. But when we give another person our attention, we're giving away that portion of our life. We don't get it back. We're giving our attention to what seems worthy of our life from moment to moment. Attention, the cultivation of attention, is absolutely core. It really is the linchpin. It is the key. On the way back to Denver to catch my flight, I got lost in the mountain foothills and began to panic, seeing few houses or cars for miles. At last, a man in a pickup truck rumbled toward me, and I flagged him down. Follow me, he said with a warm smile. When I asked for help, I'm going that way. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, rebuttals?
Why do you believe that people choose to act the way they do in terms of spending so much time doing email and also not greeting one another? I mean, that's a choice that each individual can make. If somebody doesn't greet you, you can always greet them.
Greet them, yes, yes. Oh, yes, certainly. I'm a terrible greeter at the end of the day. But yes, no, this is all a matter of choice and free will, and the collectively, bit by bit, the choices that make up the fabric of our society, absolutely. I think there are two reasons why people are fragmented, interrupted, split-focused to the point of overload. Because, as I'm saying, this is not all bad, but it has mounting costs. I believe that's why we're at a kind of turning point. There are two reasons. One is this idea of productivity. I mean, certainly Western, probably quintessentially American, that it's wonderful to tick off things in one's agenda. That's a kind of productivity that we can all love. And yet doing the messy, difficult, gray area problems, I hear again and again from people in corporate America. They just feel as though they go home at the end of the day and just put out fires. So we're not getting to those, but the easy stuff is great in this world, whether it's information bites or your to-do agenda. And secondly, again, we are programmed biologically technologically to not only get a shot of you know, a little high at the novel stimuli in our environment, but also our attention is caught by this. So children's TV, I mean all TV, but tiny children's TV is predicated on the fact that they have no choice but to watch that because of the speed, of the cuts, of the change, of the colors, of the brightness. If their survival instincts are, you know, room to pay attention to that television. So I think it's a matter of choice, and then the environment we've created to make the culture of distraction sing, so to speak.
Although you almost touched upon it in your answer here, the word I'm surprised I never heard is boredom. I mean, the guy driving the car while reading the magazine is clearly looking for efficiency, and Darwin will take care of him one way or another. But the person checking their email when they're on a phone call is probably just bored with the phone call, but can't say that and is waiting for it to end naturally, and they're bored. And I know for myself, when I'm sitting in the office and I'm, yes, interrupting myself to check my latest email, frankly, I'm doing it hoping that that next email will have something that is a lot more interesting than what I'm doing for a living. And so I think boredom is a lot of the driver of distraction.
Yeah, well, boredom and distraction are subjective, first of all. And secondly, it is relative, because what was slow in the 19th, 18th, 14th century, you know, or fast in those days, seems slow to us. So by ramping up, yes, we maybe are conditioning ourselves to be more bored. But when we get to the point when not only children, but anyone up and down the food chain has squeezed out all time for reflection, for pausing, and for doing any one thing. I'm not trying to turn us into monks by any means, and I wouldn't dare. But I do think that we've somehow gone too far. And yes, it's great to not be bored, but there's actually a lot written about the wonders of boredom and the pleasures of reverie. I think teachers would speak to that.
The fact that there is email, the fact that we have cell phones, the fact that people other than ourselves can call anybody else, email them, and expect a relatively immediate response, which means that we are concentrating while we're talking together now, wondering about what messages I have on my email. That certainly is a distraction by itself. And I think when two people talk together and they have their cell phones on and that rings, well, there's no, I think it's seldom done that the recipient of the call says, look, I'm busy right now, I'll call you back. But the fact is that there is an interruption of attention, and I think the fact that the cell phone and the internet exist, don't you think that's the basis of this problem that we have? This inability to be patient. It used to be when you wait till you get back to your office to pick up the messages. And now everybody knows it can be reached instantly and expect an instant reply.
Well, I think if you're maybe asking what role do technological tools play in this, I think they play a huge role, but they're not the whole story. I mean, I really did think actually that I was going to write a book about technology, and then I realized, really the issue is attention, because again, it's how we use the tools. I don't think these tools are in and of themselves negative. We need to use tools more wisely, but yet they're very influential. You know, you can't ignore that a BlackBerry is not a stick, it's not an axe, etc. So, I mean, I think the tools really are extremely important to this story of how we process the world. And this really is at the core a story of our relationship with our environment. Our internal environment and our external environment, because attention is like a second skin. Everything that every bit of relationship that you have with this room or your thoughts or the person sitting next to you is through the conduit of attention. And so we're really dealing with an environment environmental issue, and tools play. But beyond the tools, the neo-nomadic hyper-mobility, yes, I guess that started with tools and inventions too, that somehow we've carried. It's also cultural value systems and things like that. So it's messy. Maybe I should go over here.
You mentioned the phrase of, you mentioned the risk of a dark age just tonight. In the book, you talk at some length about what you mean by that, and I found that quite interesting. I wonder if you could just spin that out a bit more, because I think that the dangers of this distraction are more than what you had a chance to mention, the lack of a confidant. It's something to do really with the overall culture that you described in the book.
Well, that's a good point. 6 months ago, I kind of, tried to, I was a little scared to mention the whole dark age business, but now, hey, look at the headlines, folks. Yeah, no, dark age is really fascinating because everybody thinks medieval serfs, etc. But there were dark ages throughout history. I'm not an incredible expert because there really isn't very much that has pulled together all the parallels of dark ages. But I did a lot of research on reading about different dark ages, and whoever has created some sort of characteristics of a dark age. I mean, Jane Jacobs wrote a book about Dark Age Ahead before she died a couple of years ago. Harold Bloom speaks about this. Umberto Eco has compared our culture to the fall of Rome. So that also triggered my curiosity. But a dark age, as Jane Jacobs says, is not a collection of subtractions. There can be wonderful parts to a dark age. Dark ages are often technological because, as you might know, they are often less literate times. And so there can be wondrous advancements in terms of the inventions and the tools in a dark age. And not everything comes to a creaking halt. I mean, it's not the total collapse that we think it is. The university system, the compass, there are all sorts of different medieval advancements and inventions during that time. But yet, a dark age is a time of cultural forgetting, a time when we cease to learn from the past in a way that moves us forward. And I also think that there's no handy-dandy rule book about what, hey, we just entered the dark age. I really think, and to be serious, I really think we're creating our own definition of a dark age when we're so unable to listen to one another. I mean, doctors, as I mentioned in the book, interrupt a patient on average after 18 seconds. Wow. And the role of the machinery in our age. I mean, there are two different genius, MacArthur-type fellow professors who I interviewed for the book from very different fields, who both, without any prompting or questioning on my part, said, I think we're turning into an autistic society. And that gave me pause. So there are a lot of ways in which maybe in this, as we rethink the culture of affluence, as we are forced to rethink the culture of affluence that we so lovingly swallowed blindly, we may want to rethink the affluence of other parts of our lives, the social abundance, I mean, not affluence, but social abundance, the informative. And that doesn't mean, oh, we're going to ignore information or ignore others or go back to village living. It just means we need to think about how to recover these lost arts. So I think there's a great book to be done in what is a dark age. Yeah.
Speaking of a dark age, I was wondering if you saw there was an editorial in the New York Times talking about what would be necessary, promoting in a very subtle way, that drugs are going to be developed so we can get more productivity and be able to have all these influences coming at us.
I'm sorry, what's going to be developed?
Drugs.
Oh, I thought you said drugs.
Drugs.
Carpets of progress.
No, and I guess I found it. I'm sorry?
I didn't see that, but
I'll try and find it for
guess
you
the issue.
and send it to you, because I thought it was a very manipulative thing to even give something like that credence by just even allowing it to be an editorial. But which brings me back to the concept of distraction and whether it's an economically forced agenda. Because as you know, for example, if you look at some of the social networking like Twitter or some of the popular applications that you put on an iPhone, they're actually not very productive in and of themselves. It's not that it really does a lot for you, but it's just another piece of noise. You know, something to buy, something to read up on, and that is what I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit, because you know, there is a certain amount of efficiency, but there's a certain amount of not being able to, I guess, a bit of manipulation in it all, because it makes money.
Right, we're in a market-driven economy that fosters
right. I mean, if you do
abduction of our attention.
If your doctor is getting you in and out very quickly, it's because he's making more money by doing that. And it's not just your doctor; it's your insurance companies, it's your credit card statements. If you don't look at the details, you can get a lot more money out of it as a corporation.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a complex. Yes. So, I mean, some people have actually asked me, you know, what's the link between capitalism and distraction, or do we have, you know, is capitalism to blame for? So, I mean, that's a question beyond my expertise, but I think there are a lot of different elements to your question. You know, I think that we are, Americans, as Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, have, quote, a restless temper. And we are, you know, business people, immigrants, pioneers. Some people argue we have the ADH gene in our blood because we're so, you know, highly productive, and efficiency and money are on the, you know, sort of what we worship. So maybe it's, you know, a particular climate in this country that fosters distraction in these monetary ways. And I also think it has a lot, what you're saying has a lot to do with our mediated environment. And yeah, I mean, that's a market-driven economy right there, but I think that I see an enormous and kind of invisible tussle, almost like a war of the worlds between our physicality and our virtuality. Just look at our entrancement with anything brain. I mean, you can write anything in any newspaper or publication and just say brain science, and people eat it up. Because I think part of this is because we're so disconnected from our physical world, from the earth, from you know, our sensory people, our sensory cells, that cognition has taken over, which is kind of robotic. And so I think that the idea that we're plugged into this mediated environment, which is all cognition and nothing, you know, little else, is really worrisome. You know, how there's a lot of people who worry about, and I hope I'm not seeming to digress, because I think these are really really connected issues. But there's a huge movement to try to restore children's interest in nature, you know, nature deficit syndrome. And that's really incredibly important because we are not just brains. And by allowing the, you know, thinking to dominate everything, we're sort of negating types of emotion or all sorts of different other aspects of humanity. And similarly with drugs, you know, drugs are the instantaneous, is an instantaneous ability to get better. But the harder work is crafting yourself. And that's true in so many different degrees. So the machinery and the drugs and the cognition, I think these are all issues that are alike. And so I think, again, we have to tip the balance back. So I hope that maybe answered your question a little bit. Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to say, I kind of, just coming out of my 20s, I noticed that prior to, you know, getting used to using the computer when I was younger, I had much more of an ability to concentrate, and then once I started to multitask through college and everything, and a lot of my friends are doing that, I noticed that it feels like it kind of rewires your brain to where you have a harder time getting out of that mode and diving into something deep and really putting all your awareness and concentration on it. And I noticed it a lot with friends that are about my age, where I'll have conversations with them and it never gets very deep at all, and it kind of feels like you aren't able to really explore, their thoughts, their feelings, and their opinions about something. Whereas if I talk to an older person that isn't so into multitasking, their awareness, their attention is right there for you. And I noticed that when I multitask a lot, it's harder for me to sit down and read a book. But when I get out of that and I retrain my concentration, I'm able to read, like a book in 2 days. And so I feel like, in a sense, a lot of these distractions are kind of hijacking people's awareness and productivity.
Well, that was well put. Yeah, no, I think that many people would agree with you. And how many people feel like it's a struggle to get through a book these days? If you want to, I mean, I think I do it all the time, but and people say that all the time. I mean, they have to do it in a sort of more skimming way. But I think that, when you look at the brain, we now know it's plastic. We now know the environment shapes us. So there's fascinating research on children with a gene that's correlated with attention deficits and what kind of parenting they get. And children with different type of parenting don't have the gene expression that pulls them toward impulsiveness. So the environment shapes us. Our brains are plastic from cradle to grave. This is news. This is really headline news. It's not proven, but yet I see many more scientists beginning to really accept the idea that, yes, all of the habits of mind, as William James says, actually can rewire our brains. And just take, for instance, the issue of memory. Eric Kandel, who's the Nobel Prize-winning scientist at Columbia, and who won the prize for his work on memory, wrote a great book called In Search of Memory, part memoir and part his scientific discoveries. And he said, after finishing this book, if you remember anything of what I've written, your brain will have been changed. Because in order to create long-term memory, which is actually really difficult to create, you're actually changing the synaptic conversation between the neurons, between the brain cells, which is absolutely fascinating. We do that every day. We're changing our brains. So what you said makes a lot of sense. Yes, sorry, you were waiting.
That's okay. A couple of points. Concerning the lack of greeting when you come to home, nobody looks at you except the dog. I'm just happy to see you. You're suffering a surfeit of communication during the day with the emails. It's constant communication, constant. You come home, the last thing you want to do is
engage. Right.
So that's an example of conditioning which is abrasive to family relationships. The second point, when you look at Da Vinci, for instance, let's say the best painter that ever painted, okay? He spent 4 or 5 days in notorious frenetic activity, constantly working on a project. Handel's Messiah, 21 days, virtually non-stop, he put it together. And then Da Vinci, 4 or 5 days reflecting and sitting there, and the person that he was working for, I forget the name, Baroccio's workshop, would berate him and say, what are you, just lazy, lying around here? Totally, his lifestyle, for his extraordinary, unsurpassed creativity, was precisely the opposite of the lifestyle we have today.
It's very, very interesting.
Yes,
like a lion of cognition, eat a lot and then go without food.
Precisely. The amount of contemplation and thought and that was
really
going on in his mind was just precisely the opposite of what you're
it's interesting.
here.
And Clyde Herberman, who's the Metropolitan and columnist, writes wonderfully about our world, and he once just did a little column interviewing MacArthur Fellows, the people who just won the Genius grants, and he asked them, about daydreaming, and all of them said, I don't do anything with gadgets as I walk along. They ferociously protected their daydreaming time, which is really interesting.
But the last point I want to make, you know, you have a rotary phone. I grew up with a rotary phone as a kid. And you didn't get into a cell. You go back, let's say, to use a rotary phone. It's painful to use it because you're conditioned.
Right.
But
Kids don't even
everybody's
know
had
what
the
it is.
experience of the escalator that's not working. And you're conditioned and you will fall forward because you're wired.
Right.
And this is the danger
Our
of all
environment.
of this.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is the danger of all of
We-
this. And this is a real danger. You need daydreaming time.
Yes, I completely agree. And I was told, but I have not seen it, that Milgram, who did the great psychological research in which people were mean penitentiary guards, students played the role of guard and prisoner, and they were actually incredibly cruel. But he is most famous for that. But he also did some work on urban life and stimuli, and he found that people are very overloaded. The number of stimuli that come at them every day, changes them, and they don't want to engage socially. So that's sort of interesting too. And we are, again, we're biological beings. We like to think that we don't have to pay attention to the cues of nature, of sunset or seasons. We like to pay attention. We think we don't have to pay attention to our biological cues of eating or sleeping in the 24/7 society. We certainly don't want to pay attention to the invention of the industrial age about weekends and vacations anymore. We really think that we can live not only superseding the fetters of time, but also, on our own customized clock, time. It's interesting. So,
I wonder if in your research you have found what I found observing the people who work in my office. Most of them are in their 20s, and they prefer email to a telephone conversation almost always, even if email takes a lot longer and the thread gets to number 14 or 15 for a matter that could be resolved with a 3-minute phone call. And I wonder if that generation, and perhaps this young lady can speak to that too, is no longer interested in conversing. And if it's so much easier to hide behind the email and the screen, and if we're losing that ability and that art.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because maybe that's another question related to conditioning, because I've seen many studies of high schoolers and young people who say they prefer, in fact, Generation Y. I've just seen research related to Generation Y in the workplace. They prefer FaceTime, 60, 70%, and yet they don't always use it or pursue it. High schoolers say they much prefer telephone calls to instant messaging, but sometimes I've seen some that say they're bored. So they have to do several things at once, or else they'll be bored. Telephone call is too slow. So again, it's conditioning. So I think there actually is a hunger, and I have, in traveling and talking to people of all ages and generations, I don't think this is precisely a generational issue, because we're all struggling with this. And I also feel that the hunger for connection, the hunger for quiet and problem solving is absolutely there, growing, increasing among all age groups. So it's a matter of taking action. And in workplaces, there are some companies that are taking steps to create rooms where people can think in unwired ways, or IBM has a practice. It's not a policy or a program, but it's a practice, a grassroots practice called Think Fridays. And it was started in the software engineering department, because the software engineers were so tired of never getting their patent work, their creative work done. And so they just said no meetings, no conference calls, and maybe some email on Fridays. But it wasn't a rigid, it's not a rigid rule. And so now it's spread worldwide. So that IBM, not everyone, but if you would like to, practice Think Fridays, you can step away. And ironically, the head of diversity told me that this is a way to take time off from our technology. No, at IBM. So, are we okay still for time? Yeah. Whatever. Yes.
In some of the business literature, business magazines, they've talked about people complaining about their long work hours, and when they sat down to talk about it with their bosses, it was related to they couldn't say no to the email and all that. But when the boss said, no email, no IM, no anything for 9 to 12, then they could get all the work done.
Yes, yeah, sort of creating boundaries around the workplace.
But
Yes.
they couldn't figure that out for themselves. You know, the whole thing about setting priorities and that kind of thing is a skill that a lot of people don't have, and that's part of the problem solving and all the things you're talking about.
Yes, and I think it's both individual, but it's also collective, because we are part of these social networks. And turning off the machine, the cell phone, doesn't do anything to turning off the the social demands on your attention. So it is a matter both of collective effort and individual. And discipline is a really, I mean, I really dreaded using that word because it seems pretty 19th century, but it is all of piece with attention. Utilizing your attention to its highest entails and is fueled by discipline. So that's really important. In fact, kids with better discipline actually get, let's see, how can I phrase this? Discipline is more highly correlated with better grades than IQ.
They wrote better in the 19th century.
Well, I'm not nostalgic. I think it's great. It's a great time. It's a great time. Yes.
Hi. I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I took away TV during the evening, and it was the best thing I did. But now what? Now the summer's coming, and my son's saying, "Okay, I'm going to have TV because I'm not going to be in school," or my daughter. I had to limit it, and we did. I need advice.
So when did you take away the TV?
I took it last year.
Last year.
I took it away during the week, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. You can watch TV.
Right.
And that's what I find some parents are doing now, and with the computer. We don't have a computer, we don't have a DS, we don't have what the other thing,
Game Boy? No.
it's they play it.
Wii. Yes,
the
Wii.
And we don't have that.
Yes.
And he said we're not ready to buy that right now, and we told him